We're breaking even more bricks, as Atari Archive revisits a familiar genre with Super Breakout. Today's game is the third of 4 Sears exclusive VCS releases. Unlike the other 3, however, Super Breakout was only a timed exclusive, possibly the first timed exclusive in video games. And it debuted in Sears stores around September 1981 before becoming broadly available under Atari's own branding the following January. And it's not hard to guess why Atari only allowed it to be an exclusive for the holiday shopping season. Super Breakout is a home conversion of one of Atari's major arcade hits of 1978. I'm not going to dig deeply into the history behind the original Breakout here. That story has already been told in my earlier Breakout episode. But the important factor is that Breakout was a major hit for Atari across the globe, showing that the ball and paddle genre still had some legs with some new twists, and even serving as a direct inspiration for Taito's Space Invaders. That said, Breakout was one of Atari's last major TTL, or transistor logic, based coin-op video games. This means it didn't use a microprocessor, and therefore the game logic ran on a complex array of integrated circuits. This also meant Breakout was difficult to expand upon or upgrade in a meaningful way, but with the level of success Atari had, there was definitely interest within the company. In a 1989 deposition for Atari Games vs. Taito, Super Breakout developer Ed Logg indicated that he had heard in April 1978 from fellow developer Owen Rubin about potential variations of Breakout that Atari CEO Nolan Bushnell had been considering. Since Logg had some spare time, he decided to try and develop some of these ideas into a microprocessor-based version of Breakout, running on 6502-based hardware developed for the ultimately unreleased game Dirt Bike. In an interview for the 2005 book Game Design, Logg said that he didn't consider Super Breakout a sequel to the original since the hardware was so completely different. He had to program the whole thing from scratch and with unique gameplay from the older title. As described in his deposition, and backed up by documentation held at the Strong Museum of Play, Logg's Breakout variations were initially going to each have their own individual cabinet. These included Triple Breakout, with 2 holes in the brick wall with ricocheting balls that could be freed. Canyon Breakout, where the bricks were arranged on either side of the screen with a canyon in the center the ball could go up through. Scrolling Breakout, where 4-row walls could periodically drop down to constantly force players to deal with new walls. And Vertical Breakout, where bricks from upper rows would drop down to fill in the gaps that players made by breaking bricks with the ball. In May, these were consolidated into 5 variations across 3 different cabinets, along with a new Double Breakout variant, which gave players 2 paddles stacked on top of each other a la Avalanche, and 2 balls bouncing around. Vertical Breakout was dropped by a July 1978 focus group test session, where 2 sessions of 7 players evaluated the 4 remaining variations 2 at a time. The first session focused on Double Breakout and Triple Breakout. The players found Triple required more skill and variety in the game, and found the captive bouncing balls more attractive in the demo screen. That said, they also enjoyed Double Breakout, enjoying it far more than the original arcade game, and appreciating that the extra ball and paddle provided players with an extra chance, in case they missed a rebound. The players also found that the game speed was too fast to really pay attention to the scoring during the game, and as such the bonus sound at 100 points was reportedly loud and distracting. The second section focused on Canyon Breakout and Scroll Breakout. Players found Scroll Breakout interesting compared to the original game, but found the brick movement confusing and the concept a bit inscrutable at first, suggesting a name change to better describe what was happening. Canyon Breakout was well received, as players liked the action of the ball bouncing around the center clearing. They proposed a slightly more complex T-shape to the canyon, and the addition of a prize brick buried in the wall. Based on the results of the focus test, the final version was stripped down to 3 variations in one machine: Scrolling Breakout, now known as Progressive Breakout, Triple Breakout, now called Cavity Breakout, and Double Breakout. Canyon Breakout was dropped as Vertical had been months before. Super Breakout was finalized July 28th and made its debut to coin operators in September after 4 months of development. Atari reportedly sold 4,085 units. Far fewer than the original Breakout's 11,000 units, but enough for the company to consider it a major success in the pre-Asteroids era. The first home version of Super Breakout came along in the Atari 8-bit computer line upon its debut at the end of 1979. Though trapped as it was on a fairly expensive piece of hardware, you can find complaints from newspaper columnists about the price of entry. But the VCS, particularly in 1981, was a mass-market success and an ideal target for its own home conversion. After all, the original Breakout continued to be a strong seller for the company, with 838,000 copies sold in 1981 alone. Carol Shaw started work on a VCS conversion of the arcade original, but only got as far as partially developing the game's kernel, or engine, as what she called a proof of concept of Cavity Breakout before leaving Atari for Tandem Computers in 1980. Super Breakout was then picked up by Nick Turner, who had joined the company back in February 1979, taking Shaw's kernel to modify and build out into the final game. Turner has done very few interviews, but did correspond with Ferg from the 2600 Game by Game podcast back in 2013, and Ferg graciously shared his notes with me. Turner was a self-described science nerd in his youth, and went to college for computer science, graduating from San Diego's Coleman College in 1978. He briefly worked at San Diego's Federal Savings as a systems engineer before coming to Atari. He did confirm that his Super Breakout cart uses Shaw's game kernel at its core, but that it was heavily modified for the final version of the game. The VCS package includes all three of the arcade variants, as well as a rendition of the original Breakout game. Just like in the original game, the ball will speed up when it hits a brick in one of the last 4 rows, and the panel will shrink to half its size when the ball makes it to the top of the screen. And a key difference from the original Breakout arcade game and cartridge, this version is not limited to only 2 walls. Instead, new walls will continue to spawn indefinitely, as long as players can keep the game going. This is actually true for all the variations here, giving those who master Super Breakout plenty of opportunity to aim for high scores. The other variations all feature specific quirks to add to their appeal. Progressive Breakout, for example, will give players bonus points if they hit a brick in the last possible row before they vanish square in the center. In Double Breakout, points are doubled per brick for as long as both balls remain on screen and in play, and Cavity Breakout features a similar multiplication scheme for points when 2 balls are active, tripling points if all 3 are active at the same time. Finally, the difficulty switches allow players to adjust the size of the paddle, with A more closely matching the paddle sizes in the arcade game. There are some minor differences from the arcade version and the VCS rendition, primarily related to the game's shift from a vertical monitor to a standard television. The biggest change is that Cavity Breakout now has 2 paddles. This may be a choice to help balance out the change in playfield size, but it does end up making the game a bit easier than the original. In fact, this package as a whole seems easier than arcade Super Breakout. Between the larger paddles by default and the smaller screen size, it tends to be easier to track and hit the ball back at the wall than in its coin-op counterpart. Progressive Breakout may be the standout here, as the constant movement of the walls brings to mind Space Invaders and makes the game more dynamic, but there's not really a stinker on this package. Finally, the cartridge features a children's mode that plays standard Breakout at a slow speed, without the ball's speed up or paddle halving functions seen in the normal game. While kids still need to have the coordination to line up their returns, this does result in probably the friendliest way to be introduced to Breakout-style games. It's important to note that while Super Breakout contains both the original game and these arcade variations on it, it does not supplant the original Breakout cartridge. If you're not just playing solo, Super Breakout is strictly a 2-player affair, with players alternating turns. In contrast, the older Breakout release features game modes for up to 4 players, with 3 and 4-player games splitting everyone into teams. It's also missing all the variations found on Breakout, such as the invisible wall, timed games, steerable balls, a catch function, and breakthrough games, where the ball only bounces off one of the external walls when knocked upwards. Whether or not any of these are preferable to the variations on Super Breakout is up to personal opinion, but it does make the case for both games being worthwhile, and explains why Atari continued to sell both through the 1980s. Following the trend with nearly every other VCS release of 1981, we've got a fanciful storyline in the manual describing what the player is doing. Whereas the branding on the older Breakout cabinets suggested a prisoner breaking out of jail, here we have a science fiction yarn where the player is in a ship traveling at light speed encountering a multicolored force field that they must break through to continue on their voyage. This certainly explains the astronaut on the box art, and serious kudos to whoever in marketing had to think of a way to explain Breakout using some kind of real-world analog. As to how Super Breakout became a Sears exclusive, we don't have the full story. Unfortunately, other people who would have been involved here have passed away. Ron Stringari, formerly of Sears and Atari, where he served as the Vice President of Marketing, did provide some insight in a call with me back in 2021. Stringari said Sears was always interested in exclusivity for products it sells. In some cases, Atari fulfilled those requests with special Sears branding for some games or the VCS itself. In a few rare cases, these involved games that were only sold by Sears: Steeplechase, Stellar Track, and 1982's Submarine Commander. But Super Breakout is a much higher profile game than any of those three, being based on one of Atari's coin-op successes, so Sears getting to sell it exclusively was a major coup. It's speculative, but it seems likely that Atari came to an agreement with Sears that they could have exclusivity on Super Breakout through Christmas 1981, before they'd start selling it elsewhere. This gave Sears the extremely lucrative holiday season with a brand new, major Atari home conversion, while Atari could get it under its own branding early in 1982 and promote it as part of their marketing push to have one new game released each month. Jerome Domerat's briefly glimpsed Atari games sales sheet from the Once Upon Atari documentary indicates Super Breakout was Atari's 23rd best-selling game for the VCS, though unfortunately it cuts off before giving any firm numbers. We do have numbers for 1986 through 1990, and Super Breakout was selling new copies for that entire time period, topping out with just over 40,000 units in 1987. In total, 84,172 copies of Super Breakout went out the door from Atari Corp in those twilight years of the VCS platform. Very solid sales for an older game. For reference, this means Super Breakout outsold other 1981 games in that time frame like Asteroids, Missile Command, Video Pinball, Warlords, Championship Soccer, and 1978's Breakout. While Super Breakout may not have reached the highest highs while the console was in its heyday, there were sure people interested in it when the VCS was the low-cost system on the market, making it a very steady seller to the end. Super Breakout seemed relatively well received from the contemporary sources we have. Bill Kunkel and Arnie Katz reviewed the game in the June 1982 issues of Video and Electronic Games, and in both publications they considered it better than both the coin-op original and the Atari computer versions. While all versions of the game played more or less identically, the authors felt the key advantage for the VCS version was surprisingly the audio, as Turner added in an array of sound effects for bricks breaking that the pair found far more satisfying than the muted noises of its older brethren. While the game did not win an arcade award, Kunkel and Katz named it as one of the better games designed for consoles in their 1983 awards roundup. In the video games review, the author said that the cavity and doubles game modes were too easy, but felt that the wild bounces the game can take in Progressive Breakout were worth the game's price tag. Super Breakout did see one final home conversion to the Atari 5200, where it was bundled with the console upon its 1982 launch. Based off the 1979 Atari 8-bit port, this does use the console's analog stick to a fair bit of success. When you only have to worry about two directions, a non-centering joystick isn't too hard to get a handle on. Moreover, this version had 4-player functionality, and the original 5200 units had 4 controller ports, so here was an opportunity to show that off. But while Super Breakout was a notable release for Atari, it wasn't on the same scale of success as some of the other launch and near-launch titles, such as Galaxian, Star Raiders, Pac-Man, or Missile Command. So the company wasn't taking away its own sales bundling Super Breakout with the console. That said, when its primary competition, the ColecoVision, launched with a hot title like Donkey Kong packed in, you get the impression Atari may have chose poorly here for its pack-in game. Super Breakout is good, but it's a 1978 video game attached to what is supposed to be a next-gen console at a time when the hottest arcade and console games are significantly more elaborate. Even the game's press was unenthused, with Electronic Games Review of the 5200 remarking Super Breakout was an odd choice to be packed in with a console that did not have a paddle, especially given its availability on other platforms that do, and other outlets were just about as disappointed. The company must have figured out this was a misstep, as Atari was packing in Pac-Man with the console by June the following year. Despite being a bit of a pack-in dud, Super Breakout on the 5200 is pretty good, even if playing the game without a paddle just feels wrong. Curiously, according to internal documentation, this was Atari's best-selling 5200 game of 1986 and 1987, selling 87,670 copies and 8,194, respectively. Presumably, people picking up secondhand or clearance rack 5200s, or who had gotten it during the Pac-Man pack-in era, were interested in grabbing Super Breakout. The closest thing we do see to a Super Breakout clone on the VCS is Starpath's Fireball, released a little under a year after today's cartridge. Fireball has multiple game modes much like Super Breakout, but many of them draw to mind the doubles or cavity game modes, with multiple balls in play. Instead of maxing out at 3 balls, however, the player can juggle up to 6 at a time, and while the player can hold up to 2 balls temporarily to help line up shots, missing a single one will cost them a turn. While the game's speed is slower, it can certainly get more chaotic than Atari's title, and keeping up with a huge number of balls bouncing around the screen can become difficult very quickly. Fireball was well regarded in the pages of Video Games magazine, and deserves a look for those willing to load up a game designed for the Supercharger expansion cart. This marks the end of the Breakout legacy for Atari, at least for a while. While Off the Wall on the VCS pulled from Breakout, it wasn't until the Jaguar that the Breakout name was revived for Breakout 2000. Neither of these are strictly pulling from Super Breakout either, being based more on Taito's Arkanoid, a Breakout clone released in 1986. Super Breakout may at first seem to be something of an evolutionary dead end, but it really showed some of the more fascinating ways you can put a twist on the Breakout formula for a Western audience, putting it right in line with successive ball and paddle titles. Super Breakout ends up as a great brick-breaking game in its own right, one of the finest paddle titles on the VCS. 1981's a year full of top-notch releases, and even if the unassuming and visually understated Super Breakout gets lost in the shuffle, it still very much earns its place in the year's pantheon. Next time, a 1981 release that does not count as one of the console's greats.